See, okay, so welcome back to Build Peace this morning. I can see that everyone's really excited about the connections that they're making because you're all too busy having coffee and it's impossible to get you in here for our first session, which is wonderful to see. This morning is our final dialogue, and it's a little bit different because the people are not on stage with us physically, they're with us virtually. I'll introduce them shortly. And we've done a bunch of testing, so I'm hoping this is going to go actually fairly smoothly, although it is going to sound a little bit like a walkie-talkie conversation because we're going to have to mute and unmute ourselves so that there's no echo. So please bear with us as we work out those technical difficulties. Sanjana and Juanita, can you just give me a thumbs up that you can hear us? You're hearing everything I say? Yes, awesome. Okay, so let me proceed to introducing them. So this final dialogue will be in between Sanjana Hattotuwa and Juanita León. We will be talking about social media and viral news and how they affect the future of peace negotiations. This is a conversation that has already started at several of the sessions that some of you have been attending. So I wasn't there, but I hear there was a fantastic workshop focusing on disinformation yesterday, run by Chris van der Walt and Ed McLoof. And I was talking to a few people who were there, and the conversation sounded quite intense. I also facilitated a workshop along with Giselle Lopez of Creative Associates and Jacob Lefton, who's somewhere here, also from Build Up, on social media and automation for peace building. So certainly this is a conversation that is on a lot of people's minds. And Sanjana and Juanita are great people to take us a little bit deeper and further on this conversation. Juanita León is the director of Silla, Vacía. She studied law at Universidad de los Andes, right here, and completed a master's degree in journalism from Columbia University. After working at the Wall Street Journal Americas in New York, she returned to Colombia to El Tiempo, where she worked as editor of the Peace Unit, covering the peace process with the FARC. With seed capital from the Open Society Institute, she set up Silla Vacía, which is where she is right now. Sanjana Hattotuwa is a special advisor to the ICT for Peace Foundation, where he works to further the use of ICTs in crisis information management and peacekeeping initiatives at the United Nations. He's also a senior researcher at the Center for Policy Alternatives, a fellow of the Center for Information Technology and Dispute Resolution at the University of Massachusetts, and the founding editor of the award-winning Grand Views website. I'd like to start by asking Sanjana and Juanita to each make an opening statement about their views on this topic. How are social media and viral news affecting the future of peace negotiations? So, Sanjana, if you would like to start.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me well? Excellent, excellent. So I'm very sorry that I'm not there in person. It's the first Build Peace that I'm actually not physically present at, but I hear that it's been going very well, and I'm also very happy to be able to join you over Skype video. I want to share a few thoughts with you, also because of about 15 years of work in this domain, in the trenches, as it were. I call home Sri Lanka, which is a small country to the south of India. And when I first started working with technology and peace negotiations, it was in 2002, 2001, so a very long time ago, where in my small country, we had at the time been enduring just over 2 decades of a brutal war. And there was a new government at the time that wanted a ceasefire agreement with the Liberation of Tamil Tigers Eelam, the LTTE, which was the terrorist group, and proxies and representatives of the government. Because it couldn't be held in Sri Lanka, it was held in Switzerland and other European capitals, where proxies of the LTTE were also resident and domiciled in. So I was the lead architect of a technological platform that allowed asynchronous secure negotiations around a one-text process mediated by Norway. I wasn't involved in the negotiations in terms of the substantive issues, but I created, along with 2 other colleagues, the technological architecture for the parties to kind of exchange knowledge and exchange demands and needs and work out the ceasefire agreement. So I've been working in this domain for quite a while. And I have just a few thoughts to kickstart the discussion. And it's, in a sense, coming full circle for those of the few of you who might have been at the first Build Peace a couple of years ago in Boston, Massachusetts, at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. These are some of the issues that I brought up there as well. And the first one is an issue that I call radical transparency. One of the things that has happened with viral news and social media and everything is that peace negotiations, which traditionally were closed door, removed from public scrutiny at the elite of society or the political strata, have now become porous processes where, with increasing connectivity and the affordability of connectivity, you find that these processes, which sometimes need to maintain confidentiality for obvious reasons, find it hard to do so because information is perennially leaked consciously or unwittingly out into the public domain where they obviously have a life of their own. So one of the things that I would like to talk about and place on record is I wonder what the future of a rule like the Chatham House rule would be, where the success of certain conversations depends on non-attribution. And if attribution then becomes part and parcel of our technological future, then what does it mean for the Chatham House rule and the necessity for some processes to have it? And what is more generally the future of confidentiality, which I think is integral to these peace processes and ceasefire agreements and other processes at a certain level to bring about conflict transformation in this kind of domain. For me, there's also this interesting phenomena which I would like to call radical inclusion, and radical in both senses. So radical inclusion for me is the idea that you have ever-widening stratas of society coming in and discussing at the same time, in real time, along with the negotiations process, along with track two processes, things around the issues around the negotiations process. So you have an incredible amount of people talking at the same time. Sometimes it's a cacophony, sometimes it leads to a harmonious discourse, but it's all happening at the same time. And what does it mean to be in charge of a process like that, where it's messy, it's not really structured, but radical also in the sense of spoilers, radical viewpoints, extremist ideology, spoiler dynamics that seek to derail and defame and decry and deny participation in this kind of process. When you have actors like this who are now also very powerful with technology and can influence minds, then what do you do around the creation of a democratic process? We all know, and I hope you've talked about in Bogota, the problem of filter bubbles. But very, very briefly put, my concern is that even as ever-widening circles of people are getting online and communicating with each other and getting their news and information over social media, it's constrained. And I wonder what it means for a country after decades of war, when it's engaging in a sense, in a renewal, in a rebirth, to have these pockets of discourse isolated from each other, and each one of those pockets believing that they hold the sole key to truth and the way forward. I worry about power and discrimination. I worry when we talk about fake news, when we talk about social media, very often we don't talk about it with a gendered lens. We don't talk about it with a class, caste, socioeconomic lens. Where are the marginal voices? Where are the tribal voices? How do we bring about a more equitable process, even as we talk about the ill effects of fake news and the kind of problems that we see with social media today? And to just 2 points to end with, I worry about the ability of technology today to pose a threat to the kinds of processes we talk about. 15 years ago, what we did was so radical, so new, it had no historical precedent. There was no literature I could learn from. There was no Build Peace conference. There was no parallel process in the past that we could construct our work on. So it was very, very new. And technology was a good thing. It was a democratic thing. It was an enabling thing. It helped us do things better. But now it's not so clear. And The Economist, I think about a month or two ago, said that social media is now a threat to democracies and the kinds of processes we're talking about. So I wonder what we will deal with in the future as these things get more complex. And finally, what does it mean to have people connected? We seem to take that as a good. We seem to take that as something that is desirable. But for me now, the central challenge is the politics of exclusion. I think by default, as opposed to when I first started working, people are part of these processes by default. If they want to tune in, if they want to tweet, if they want to do a blog post, if they want to live stream, if they want to be a consumer of this information, they can. Now it becomes the process architecture and the design around exclusion. When to exclude, who to exclude, what to exclude, in order for the sanctity and the strength of the process to move forward in light of everything that you would have talked about around fake news. So that the politics of exclusion, the technologies of exclusion are central to me. And I want to end with a quote by researcher Dana Boyd from Microsoft. And I quote, she says, "We have a cultural problem, one that is shaped by disconnects in values, relationships, and social fabric. Our media, our tools, and our politics are being leveraged to help breed polarization by countless actors who can leverage these systems for personal, economic, and ideological gain." And I think that goes to the heart of what I hope these 45 minutes will discuss. Thank you.
Thank you, Sanjana. That was, I think, a very deep and complex look at some of the problems that are coming up in terms of social media and viral news. And I like how you both talked about the context that you sort of are rooted in with Sri Lanka and your work in Sri Lanka, but also the global challenges that are emerging about this. You quoted an article in The Economist about social media being a threat to democracy. I believe that article actually it comes from a piece of research that the Omidyar Foundation recently did, which is by the same title, Social Media as a Threat to Democracy, which I strongly recommend that anybody in the audience who wants to delve deeper to some of these questions that Sanjana brought up also takes a look at. It's an excellent report. Juanita, to tell us a bit about your reactions to some of these points and also specifically your experience in the Colombian context and how social media and viral news have affected the context here in Colombia, if you'd like to make a statement now.
Bueno, primero quería saludar a todo el auditorio, perdón estar allá presente, estoy recién operada y en muletas y entonces era más fácil hacerlo desde la casa. Entonces ahora sí voy a hablar en inglés. Hi Sanjana, I'm turning to English. Well, I think that confidentiality is difficult at this time in a peace process, but it is possible, as it showed in the Colombian peace process, where our negotiators were in Cuba, where they really had very little internet access. They had a lot of government control. The Cuban government was really controlling the communications. So I think our process had a lot of confidentiality, even when there is a lot of communication around. But I think that what really makes me think about the social networks and a peace process is how the communication of the agreement was determined by social networks. I think the government didn't really realize the power of networks, and they thought that by explaining the agreements in the traditional newspapers and in TV, they really were getting the message through, and they didn't realize the power of social networks to where the interpretation of the agreement was done in a second. As soon as an agreement was published in social networks, in Facebook, in Twitter, in WhatsApp, people were doing their own interpretation of the agreement, and they were very much influenced by the people that has influence in the social networks, like Uribe. So I think that I think that's a lesson learned, that if you are going to do a peace process, you really have to understand how to communicate it in the social networks, because it is there that the interpretation is going to be given initially, and changing that idea afterwards is very difficult. Also, my experience covering the peace process was to see how information was circulating via WhatsApp, totally under the radar of the government. And it was in WhatsApp where all this idea of gender ideology was transmitted, went viral. We covered how a group in Bucaramanga of a YouTuber and a group of really religious people started this WhatsApp chains saying that the agreement had gender ideology, and they connected with a lot of parents via the council of parents at the high schools and middle schools, and they distributed that information like very fast, and the government was totally unaware of that. So I think that, and that was really important in mobilizing people against the agreement. So I think that what's very interesting about this peace process in terms of communication was the power of WhatsApp, that is a channel that you cannot really even know what people are talking about. It was not even Facebook or Twitter that they are quite public. It was something that it was completely private, like WhatsApp. So I think that there is something to think about in a peace process regarding that. Okay, I'll finish here so that we can have a conversation.
Thank you, Juanita. And I also particularly want to appreciate Juanita because as a result of this Skype setup, we asked her to intervene in English when she would normally be speaking in Spanish. So thank you for the extra effort to also accommodate our translation needs. I really appreciate that. I very much like the way you have both problematized this situation around social media and viral news. And I guess in a way now, some of the questions that I'd like to address to both of you are with regards to some of the solutions or the activities that we could take forward to address some of these problems. So one of the things that you've both talked about is the fact that governments, institutions, and I would also say peace builders are sometimes a little bit taken by surprise or left behind when polarizing speech starts to happen, or when information starts to be distributed or opinions start to be formed over social media. So Juanita, you just talked about the power of WhatsApp in getting information out and the government not being aware that that was even happening or having a handle on how that was happening. So I guess my question to both of you is, what can we do about it? What can we do to make sure that the way that opinions are being formed and the way that information is being shared around a peace process is more thoughtful and sorry, I seem to be having a problem with the Skype as well. Okay, we'll just ignore that for a second. So the way that opinions are being formed is more thoughtful and slowed down, or at least that we react to the rapid formation of opinions that can be polarized. So any thoughts around that from either of you? Maybe Juanita, if you'd like to start with a reaction to that, and then we'll switch to Sanjana.
Well, I really like the idea of radical transparency that Sanjana was talking about, and I was wondering if maybe it would be a good idea to see live the discussion of the negotiators on the peace on the table. Maybe if they were transmitting live the discussion, people would start understanding how difficult it is to come to an agreement. What were the needs of each party? What was the logic of the negotiation? I know that this would be very radical and that probably would be very difficult for the negotiators to do it. But I think at this time of radical transparency, that would really take away part of the suspicion that people had, at least in Colombia, towards the agreement. A lot of people thought, okay, Santos is really giving away the country to the guerrillas. There is a hidden agenda. And I think that if you could see it, maybe you could understand, it's really difficult. I understand the logic of the guerrillas. I understand the logic of the government. It would be kind of a like a very I don't know the word, but something that people could really learn a lot on how difficult it is. And I know that initially that could maybe make negotiators very, very shy, and in a negotiation is difficult and you are trading a lot of things. But I think that would be a solution, just to go more transparent and to show the process. Really, I think people would learn how difficult it is and would understand more what's at stake.
Thank you, Juanita. I mean, that's a pretty radical suggestion, right? Let's live stream peace negotiations, make it completely transparent, so that then there's no kind of, there's no equivocation about what happened in that room. We certainly have that with some parliamentary discussions, so there are a number of parliaments that already live stream their discussions. But Sanjana, when you spoke, what I heard you say is, actually, I'm a little concerned about the fact that it's so difficult to maintain confidentiality, and I'm worried about the threat to the Chatham House rule. So I'd love to hear your reaction to Juanita's proposal.
Juanita, I think that's a very, very interesting idea. My response is based on being part of, I think, as you were as well, at the actual negotiations process. I mean, I was in my mid-20s at the time, and we were sitting at the back of the room. It was so fascinating to see these older people, thrash things out. And as you quite correctly say, I mean, some of the perceptions around the compromises, the necessary compromises that occur in the room, we wish were communicated to the wider public so that they could understand some of the complexities, and that there is actually sometimes no hidden agenda behind it, and just how hard those compromises are. I do have some concerns, though. Helena, while I take the point that parliamentary broadcasts are all well and good, a peace negotiations process is not a parliamentary broadcast. And one fundamental difference, again, from just being part of one, is that the greatest risk around compromise doesn't necessarily come from the other with the capital O. It comes from your own side, your own party, because sometimes they are the ones who need the most convincing that that compromise is valid and necessary in order for the process to move forward. So in Sri Lanka, the greatest threat of around, say, assassination or the process being derailed came from within each camp, not necessarily from the other side that one was negotiating with. And in that light, I wonder whether live streaming a negotiations process is also the most advisable thing all the time. Because as Juanita very correctly mentioned, the rapidity of social media perceptions is instantaneous. And there are a million experts out there on every single T and I that's dotted. So it's impossible to really maintain the sanctity of a process and that necessary compromise if I think everything is going to be open all the time for everybody in real time together to kind of prize open and to debate and discuss. So I don't know what the compromise is, but I'm not entirely convinced that that radical transparency all the time works in a negotiations process. But I want to make two other brief points in response to your first question. Your first question was around, so what do we do about this? And there are, of course, that's an entire discussion in and of itself, but I think quite simply, let me say this. Those of you in the room, Helena, you as the organizers of Build Peace, and Juanita, you and I think are the better angels of process design in the future. And I think what we need to kind of tell ourselves and tell others is that technology is now integral. It's inextricably entwined in a negotiations process. How you do it, what you use to do it, which language, when, with whom, and why, these are all questions that need to be negotiated in the negotiations process. But you cannot, in my mind, have a negotiations process without technology. In Sri Lanka, in the villages, all the people congregate around a well where they get water. So if you want to communicate something, you don't go house to house, you go to the well. And technology today is the well of a negotiations process. It is where people form their opinion, it's where they generate attention, it's where they engage with the process. And I think that the process design needs to take into account where people gather and then go to those places and explain the process, explain the compromises, and then go to the people without having the people kind of debate all of this in a vacuum. And I think we need, one last point, we need to be careful about confirmation bias. If it is the case that we champion 100% transparent process, the assumption there is that people understand what the compromisers are and what the politics are. And I'm not convinced about that. In deeply divided societies, you have entrenched positions, and they are not ones that are easily things that people like to revise their opinion about. So no matter how factual you think the actual transmission of the process may be, it may actually serve counterintuitively to deepen and widen the societal divides. So I think technology needs to play a role in bridging the divides, which may not actually be the way that Juanita mentioned, but maybe a compromise is necessary. We need to be contextual in our application of technology as well. And Juanita and you guys in the room are the best architects around what you should do in Colombia. Perhaps I have no relevance and role there. So I think contextual application of technology is also a fundamentally important point as an answer, Helena, to your question.
Thank you, Sanjana. And Juanita, I'd love to hear your reaction to what Sanjana just shared. I want to add maybe one additional question to what he's saying. I know that La Silla Vacía is in fact trying in many ways to do this, so perhaps you could tell us a little bit about exactly what La Silla Vacía is doing in this space. But I also wanted to point out, we had a very interesting conversation at the workshop yesterday about social media and automation, where we talked about if as peace builders we're going to use social media to try and lessen polarization in peace processes in general, but actually we were talking about Colombia specifically, what kind of messages are going to be convincing over social media? And what we were coming to in our conversation, and what we've also seen from research by a lot of people in different contexts, is that conversations around facts on social media don't always help. In fact, they can worsen polarization, because by sharing facts, what you're doing is you're providing an opportunity for a debate to happen around the factual conversation. And often it's emotional arguments that are winning on social media. So the question we had is it ethically acceptable for us as peace builders to also use emotional arguments? And if so, what are the ethics around that? What are the ethics of using emotional arguments?
Helena, is it ethical to do what? Sorry, you cut off there.
Is it ethical to use emotional arguments as opposed to fact-based arguments? So Juanita, if you'd like to just comment on what Sanjana said and maybe on this little piece that I added, that'd be great.
Okay, so first I'm going to, I agree with Sanjana that in a peace process, and in Colombia it was totally like that. The resistance came a lot from within each camp. In the government, in the government camp, the role that, for example, General Mora played was key. He really opposed, for example, that the army would have any responsibility as an institution in the Truth Commission or in the justice system. And that was a really tough discussion within the negotiators. Mora finally lost the battle after, in the renegotiation with the no, they wanted the military, won that point. But the resistance within was very high. And I understand that, that it is difficult to communicate that if you do the transmission live. But even so, I think that if it depended on me, I would take the risk, because I think that in this age, transparency really is like a very appreciated value. And I think that people at the end, after seeing a lot of these chapters, would really understand. But now coming to your question, Helena, I think that, McLuhan said, the medium is the message. And I think that in internet, we really have to understand that communication has changed a lot, and the medium of social networks is very visual and is very emotional, and all the information is condensed in an image like a meme. And I think that the peace builders have to really understand to communicate in that language. And also journalists, I mean, at La Silla, we are really working on how we can move into that sphere and start conveying facts through other means like memes or like videos with humor. We really have to move into that sphere because you know we can keep on doing this very thoughtful text, and people are not going to read it and they are not going to understand information in that way. So I think it is ethical to really learn the language of the medium, and the language of the medium of the social networks is not totally fact-based. It has a lot of visual information that helps build an emotion around a fact. So I think that you have to learn it, and that it is just like a door that you open for people to go to information. But if you do not open those doors, you can have a lot of information and people are not going to use it or to assimilate it.
Thank you, Juanita. That was very interesting. And sorry, Sanjana, in case that got lost in translation, meme is just the Spanish way of pronouncing meme. So it's, in case that was lost in translation, I'm just making that link. And I'd love to hear just your reaction to what Juanita just shared about changing the language in which we speak and learning the language of social media.
Well, it's an interesting thing because since 2006, when I started Ground Views as a civic media initiative in the country to unpack the fiction around war. The final stage of the war in Sri Lanka, which in total lasted around 30 years, started in late 2006 and ended mid-2009. And it was extremely brutal. And there was a lot that wasn't being said, wasn't being written about, wasn't being covered. And to have those discussions was why I started off the platform. So, and those discussions continue today, 11 years after that. So I think that, there are a couple of things here. One is that it's not black and white. The adoption and adaptation of technology by peace builders needs to be creative. And it's not about abandoning facts. It's about engagement, imagination, creating new ways for people to engage with hard to understand concepts. And sometimes I work myself out of that and facilitate the conversation. At other times, I want an intended outcome. At other times, I project my bias and ask people to respond. At other times, I give people the opportunity to project their bias and I respond. So it's a combination of all of these things in terms of intentionality and then purposeful use of technology, and then finally trying to find out exactly what you want as an outcome. So I think these are complex things that we need to discuss, but it's happening. I mean, I'm doing this in Myanmar, I've done it in Pakistan, I've done it in Afghanistan, I've done it this year in the Balkans, and this is something that we now teach. You call it in different ways. You call it strategic communications, you call it countering violent extremism, you call it situational awareness, the UN has 101 terms around it. But it's not as if, and I keep coming back to the point, when we started doing this in Sri Lanka 15, 16 years ago, there was no historical precedent and there was no social media. And today, I think there's a lot that we can learn from other processes, from marketers, from advertisers, from cognitive neuroscience, around how you can craft messages and how you can create ways for people to engage with the complexity of a process using technology. So I don't really think it's black and white. I don't think it's abandoning things. I think at the end of the day, you have to be ethical. You have to be principled. You have to use technology to push forward a process and greater understanding. So it's not about creating fake news or false news of our own just for the sake of sustaining a process that we think is beneficial over the longer term. That's not what I'm talking about. But I think that these are complex issues. We can't talk about these in 45 minutes. But I don't think it's the abandonment of ethics or principles when we talk about embracing technology to strengthen complex negotiations, referenda, plebiscite, electoral, or peace negotiations process.
Thank you, Sanjana. And I'm going to just throw a final question at both of you because I'm looking at the time and being aware of our timing. And I think a little bit building on what you both just said about the complexity of this, the complexity of trying to communicate in a more emotional way while still retaining the depth that is necessary to communicate a peace process. I wanted to also throw out another issue, which is something that came up for me personally quite recently. I live in Catalonia. And you've probably been following what's happened in Catalonia in Spain. There was a referendum that was not recognized by the national government, and there was a great deal of organization around it. One of the things that I found is that a lot of the nonviolent activists were organizing using WhatsApp. And the use of WhatsApp made them very, very good at responding rapidly to situations and responding in a nonviolent way, but it also made them incredibly fragile. It was very easy to troll the WhatsApps. And in fact, the WhatsApp groups that were used to organize nonviolent action were trolled. A lot of essentially quite far-right people in Spain infiltrated these groups and proceeded to flood them with porn as a way of basically demoralizing the activists. So for me, that example really brought up this idea of it's not just that we're dealing with a very complex environment where many different opinions are being formed in different ways and rapidly and polarized, and we have to think about how to communicate in different ways, but we're also dealing with an incredibly fragile environment that can very rapidly be turned in a different direction. So I wonder if you could maybe, in closing, say anything else that you wanted to say, and also address this issue of fragility that I just mentioned, if that would be okay. Maybe Juanita, if you'd like to start, and then we'll go to Sanjana.
Yeah, I think that what Sanjana says about technology, that it's it has two sides and it's never black and white, but that we really have to incorporate that that is totally intertwined in a peace process. I think that's key. And right now we're talking about WhatsApp. I mean, in Colombia, as I suppose is in Catalonia, WhatsApp is a really powerful means of communication. People use it a lot. It doesn't happen like that in the US, for example. But in the next peace process, it won't be WhatsApp. It's going to be something else. It's going to be Snapchat or. So I think that we really have to be ahead, understand where the conversations are taking place. And I think that the most important thing is to really not expect people to go to where you are, but you have to go to where people are talking. You really have to get into the conversations of people. At La Silla, we started fact-checking WhatsApp chains because we realized that that was the means where people were really getting the information and getting their criteria about things. So we really wanted to be inside their conversations. So we're doing that, and that has been quite successful. But I think that the negotiators and the peace builders really have to open up conversations where they are taking place. Using GIFs, I think that GIFs right now are very powerful to really shape, help shape other frameworks of understanding about the peace process. So, my final argument would be to get into the places where people are talking and talk in the language that they are talking. Not try to be like really arrogant and believe that they are going to come to you and that they are going to understand the way you talk, because that's not the way it happens.
Thank you, Juanita. And Sanjana, if you'd like to also make a statement.
Juanita, I'm in complete agreement with you. And Helena, I think that counterintuitively from me, particularly at a Build Peace conference, I think that it needs to be stressed that technology is an add-on. What do we mean by peace? Peace is here. Peace is here, first here and then here. So we need to invest in people. This is a people-driven process. Peace is something that people create within themselves and amongst themselves. And our job, I think, as kind of being ahead of the curve around this, is that we need to then architect the ways that technology can help people. And the essential fragility of a peace process is also because it's human. It's a very deeply human construct. So for me, where I approach technology is that it's not a technological discussion for me. We talk about memes and GIFs and asynchronous communication and Facebook and Twitter and whatnot. All of that is, I think, secondary to what you want to see in terms of social and political, equitable and just change. That is the heart of a peace process. And the technology needs to support that. That is my understanding of building peace through technology, not to see technology as the be-all and the end-all and the first step. First for me is people, understanding the essential fragility of a conversation and a process, and then seeing how technology can help. And that also, the flip side of that is to be non-prescriptive. WhatsApp actually works very well in Sri Lanka, but it works horribly in Afghanistan for a variety of reasons that are beyond the scope of these 45 minutes. So it's to be non-prescriptive. For us, it's to see in Sri Lanka, what do the 18 to 34-year-old age group do online? What do they use? Where are they going? What are the apps they use? How do they talk? What are they interested in? What kind of languages do they use? And then we go to them, as Juanita said, with the kind of messages that we want to communicate to the places that they congregate, using the languages and the expression that they speak. May I just say one thing in passing, Helena, and this is a point I made a couple of years ago at the first Build Peace conference as well. I think the elephant in the room is corporate ownership. We don't talk enough about, when you talk about essential fragility of conversations, we don't talk about enough, at least for me, about the fact that it's Silicon Valley now that are the custodians of processes that are happening in Colombia and in Sri Lanka. You and I are not the sole owners of this information. We are mediating our conversations and our politics on technologies and apps and tools and platforms that are coming out of Silicon Valley and another context, another politics, another ideology. And that is a concern for me in terms of longevity, archiving, the politics of the technology, the politics of the code, and how all of that plays into how the politics of technology plays into the kind of processes that we are talking about, which are organic and anchored to local contexts in our respective countries.
Thank you, Sanjana. And I just feel like what you both said now, I could ask about 15 more questions, and I'd be quite happy to stay here for 4 more hours, but I'm sure you don't have the time. We also have a very full program. Sanjana, you said that the people in this room are all the better angels of technology for peace. And I appreciate you saying that. I also want to say that I think you two are particularly inspiring, and the work that you're doing. I mean, you really are our better angels. So thank you for joining us and for inspiring us with the work that you're doing on technology and peace, and for sharing these thoughts about social media and viral news. Thanks very much, and if we could have a round of applause for our speakers. I'm going to be hanging up now, and we're going to move on to our next session, so thank you again.